This is Grampie Bagnall, and he's reminiscing, talking about what we call the olden days, or you call the older days, that we grew up in. Some of the people I knew and some of the things that I did during the course of my life, why I did them and why they were important to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the easiest thing to say is for you to realize that I was born into the last of the Depression years. I was born in 1934. And it was still kind of nasty around. A lot of people didn't have jobs, and what they had, they scraped together whatever money they could as payment. My dad happened to be in the National Guard in Holton, Maine. This is in Aroostook County and is the northernmost county in the state of Maine. And he did well for us. I never knew that we were poor.
Mm-hmm.
And consequently, we never were poor. We had everything we needed. He took care of us. He managed to move out of an apartment that we lived in when I was a kid, a little feller. And he and my mother built a house from scratch. So they had a brand new house built during the latter days of the Depression. He didn't get a lot of time. We moved into it, but we weren't able to stay because my father, the National Guard unit that he belonged to, was federalized. And they wound up going down, training, and going to the getting ready in preparation for going to Europe during the Second World War. And this was going to be the war to end all wars. And it was the spirit of the time. Everybody was joining the army. They were going to Europe. They were going to fight against Hitler. And the country was still young.
Mm-hmm.
And we were still learning how to be a country. If we have ever learned since, I don't know. But at that point, he saw fit to rent our house and leave it rented while he was preparing and while he was in Europe. My mother and my younger brother and I were allowed to accompany him as he went down the East Coast training and preparation to go into the Second World War. And
so he was an officer then?
I don't know if he was an officer. He probably was.
If you could go with him, that's what made me think that.
Because he could pick us up and take us along. And the first place I remember living was in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And the age of that place, again, you can govern it by things I remember about Fayetteville. It actually had a slave market in the town itself, unused, but it was a pagoda that was built right in the middle of the town square. And it was the first time I began to realize a little bit about what the transition of the black people to human beings and citizens amounted to.
Mm-hmm. Where it had been, compared to where you were then and were wanting to go.
And I doubt that they allowed the slave market to stand afterward. It was in good shape, but what it amounted to was a wide open pavilion in the middle of the square. People would come into the square and sit all around this thing. The Negroes would be taken up on the top of this platform, pagoda-like. It had a roof that went up over the top. And it made enough of an impression on me, so I still remember what it looked like.
Right.
And can describe it to some degree. It's like in towns like Holton, my hometown, had band concert.
Like a band shell kind of place.
It was a pagoda set in the middle of the town park, and anybody that could play an instrument could join the town band. And on Thursday evenings, we would go down, and everybody would sit in their cars, park all around the community gardens, you know, and listen to them play the thing and blow their horns when the thing was over, and place of clapping and everything. And it was nice. But from there, we moved on down to, what was the name of that place in Florida? But at any rate, we moved to Florida and lived there while my dad went through training at a military base that was there. And we were there a short time. I was not impressed with Florida at all. The one thing I do remember is Mother took the two of us. I don't remember if my dad was with it or not. But we went to St. Augustine. And here you got on a boat, and it had a big table on the bottom deck. And it was glass, so that you could look down and you could see all the marine life down underneath the boat. That impressed me a great deal. I never saw a boat like it. I've never heard anybody else describe it, but you do see pictures in zoos and places where you walk it along and you go beside a fish tank that's beside you. You were actually looking down in the environment that they lived in. And I remember that. The other thing that I remember about Florida, and this I disliked, was the sand. There's no dirt down there at all. You go out and dig, and all you see is more sand. So it's sandy beach, and
you couldn't grow a tomato or potato to save your life.
Yeah. But the landlady where we rented an apartment during our time there, it was during the war, and there was conservation of everything. You know, everything was rationed. You had to have a ticket to buy a pair of shoes, and you only could buy a pair of shoes, not when your shoes wore out, but at the end of 6 months, they assumed that you needed another pair of shoes. And everybody in the family had an allotment of these tickets, and you had to have one to prove that you weren't trying to take over the supply of shoes and selling them on the black market.
Sure.
But those were kind of interesting too. She, being a conservative, used to get me every Saturday morning, and we practically lived out of tin cans for food. And she had and saved and washed all of the tin cans that she had and then flattened them. And she would get me every Saturday morning. She would pay me a quarter and say, go out and bury these cans around the roots of all the trees in the yard. So I'd turn over the sod and I'd place the tin cans down and then bury them again. She was convinced that this helped the trees grow. Whether they did or didn't, I don't know, but I remember planting the cans. From there, we moved on to Oklahoma and lived in Oklahoma for a short period of time. We lived in Texas for a short period of time. And the last place that we moved was to California. And we lived in a town named Banning, Banning. Small place, and I went to school there. And my experiences as a new kid, always the new kid going into school, and it hurt because they were not good to outsiders, you know. They're like, we treat outside people up here in Maine. Only with kids it's worse. They really get on you.
I've been a new kid in Maine.
Yeah. But we stayed in Banning until such time as the unit that my dad was part of was shipped over to Italy. where they fought their way up through Italy and over the Alps and on into France and Holland and different places. And he wound up fighting in the Battle of the Bulge in Germany, which was the epitome or the final grunt of the Nazis at the end of the Second World War. It was the one that broke their backs. They couldn't continue any longer. But as an Army brat, I was always the outsider at every single school that we stopped at. They either already had started their school year, and they had their own cliques formed, and the kids had grown up and gone to school together, so that when I got there, they'd look at me and I think, that's the new boy. I was always the new kid, and I never made friends very quickly. I was only there for 6 months, maybe, while my dad was training, and we would move on to the next place where he'd get training. And this bothered me. Every single one of these schools, I was always, he's the new kid. And when you would go out at recess to play, last man picked up for any team because nobody wanted to have me, So when we got to California, I was sick and tired of this happening, and I said, I'm going to set the pace out here in California. I said, I'm going to come up with a plan and ingratiate myself with the kids right off the bat. I'll establish my position, and I'll be one of them. Said, I'm not going to stay back and wait for them to become my friends, So I said, what I'm going to do is the next day, and you go out to recess, it was just like it. You pick the super athlete out of the school would be the captain of one team, and the second best maybe might be the captain of the other team. And you'd say, okay, I'll pick him to be on my team, and alternate choices until Fred was the last boy had to be picked. And I said, I don't care, because this is going to start today. I'm going to do it today. This kid that captained one of the teams would select the very best of the athletes. And this kid was popular. They liked him. He literally ran for a touchdown every time he had the football in his hands. And it's because the other kids did not want to tackle him, partly out of fear, and partly because it wasn't the thing to do. And I learned this the hard way. I said, when he gets the ball, he's not going to run for a touchdown this time. I said, I'm going to knock him down, flatten him. And I did. He got it, started down the field. I not only went over where he was, I chased him, and he was fast. Only I ran, caught him, and flattened him right down in the dirt. And I said, I've got it made. They realized that the superstar answered to me. I didn't beat on him or hurt him or cajole him or anything else. This is the way I play football. Well, that was great when I found out it wasn't working. All the other kids just shied away from me, just like they always had, because this was their star that I had tackled. And nobody tackled their star. Even them, they didn't do it because they wanted him to be the star of the team, And it was a big deal if he picked you to be on his team. And so, again, I was rejected as the outcast. And here I thought this was going to be my solution to a problem that had bothered me all the way across the country. And so I learned myself. You got to have a bit of understanding of people. Sit back and take a look and see what's happening before you go in and you make your move and to try to establish yourself. So California was a wash as far as I was concerned. But that's the story I wanted to tell. It was character building for me, because I learned that I was not quite as sharp as I thought I was. I thought I could outreason the situation and take care of it my own way. No, I should have learned by let osmosis take over and do it slowly, do it correctly. Make friends with the guy probably is the best way to do it. And it wouldn't be long before he'd select me on his team, and rather than carry the ball himself every time, he would share it with me a little bit, and that would help. I was no shakes as a football player. I wasn't a good athlete or anything else, but I tried to establish myself as such on that day. But I just wanted to add that to the character building nature of what I've said so far in my dissertation. Mm-hmm. So what do you do with Mom, me, and my brother Mike, who was 4 years younger than I was? She said, well, what we'll do is go back. We've rented the house, and it's rented to good people, and they're taking care of it. What we will do is go back and go up on the farm with my father and mother. And that sounded like a logical thing. She said, we'll wait out the war up there. And it'd be a good chance to stay with the older folk, and help them get through the necessary problems of old age. So we went back across the country, and much of this, we didn't fly.
Was this train or car?
This would have been automobile.
Okay.
Yep.
So Grampie drove you too, all the way across the country.
It was a little convoy, really, because there were a group of the women that were traveling with their officer husbands. And they formed a card playing clique, and they would rent close to each other as they could as they traveled from base to base. They almost always moved as a unit, so you'd meet the same people when you got to your new base.
Interesting.
Yeah. So there was some help, but she had to get back across the country, and we wound up in Portage. By the time it wasn't called Portage, it was Portage Lake. Mm-hmm. Well, of course, Portage Lake is a body of water, not a town.
So you weren't floating on a boat.
No. But this was a beautiful little community as far as I'm concerned. One of the nicest that I think I've seen. The main road north, going through it, goes right up to Fort Kent in the tip of Aroostook County. And it starts down around Patton. If you know where Patton is, or if you could find a map, you could find Patton. And it went through Ashland. And if you went east from Ashland on one of these, what they called a corduroy road. A corduroy road is one that goes across a swamp. And they simply felled trees and cut off things and put them side by side and paved them over or covered them with dirt. And they rippled like a washboard would. And these were corduroy roads, but we've traveled that many, many times. Mm-hmm. And so as you went north, they had railroads in those days. There were railroads. But also, a thing of interest, I saw the last drive of logs come down the Aroostook River, which was parallel to this road that went north from Ashland up through Portage and on to Fort Kent. And I took occasion to watch loggers on logs and pulp coming down the river.
Sure.
And each farmer had his own identification code on it so they would know whose pulp or log they were pulling out of the water.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how the farmers get paid for their logging their logs off the property. When they weren't raising potatoes, they had to have something to do. And so they would go in and cut timber.
Mm-hmm.
They would cut firewood. They would cut pulp and send it in to be manufactured into paper.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was an interesting thing.
Right.
And I'll bet up there today, you can go along the edge of that Aroostook River and still find pieces of bark that were washed into the bushes and things along the side. And this was some time ago.
Yeah, but the men would just stand on the logs in the water.
Yeah. That was the end of that. They didn't on pulp.
I don't think OSHA would prove that today.
No, I don't think they would either. They would always scared me. These people that were on the logs, you only see them in contests today. They get on and they try to spin them and stop quickly and put the other one in the water. But when you're in there with 5 or 6 other logs come floating down the river, particularly at high water time, you were quite apt to be in danger.
You better be nimble.
Fall in and never get out. Mincemeat.
Yeah.
So we wound up a little bit. That's just briefly where Portage Lake is. It was called Portage Lake because in Portage there was a nice lake right there.
Mm-hmm.
And as you went through town, you went up a steep hill, and it was called Hayward's Hill. Hayward's Hill because the farmer at the foot of the hill was named Hayward, and it was steep. It was so steep that some cars couldn't pull it. And in the winter, extreme difficulty getting up the thing. There were farmers that utilized their farm equipment, the tractors and what all, to just, they'd leave it sitting at the top of the hill, at the bottom of the hill, until some stranger comes along and says, well, geez, you just go up this hill, you know. And they used to hook onto them and haul them up so that they could get these people up on the hill. It was reasonably smooth sailing from there to Fort Kent, but it was a steep hill.
Yeah.
And
it's like having a river and you had the only ferry across.
Yeah. Yep. And the interesting thing, when you went into town, coming from the south, there was one grocery store that was there on the right-hand side, and one bar, restaurant, hotel on the left-hand side, and it was loggers going in and out, and the people from the wilds, you know, on the other side. And you continued on from there, and the next building on the right-hand, the eastern side of the road, was another little general store. And it's much like these you see on American Pickers. You go in and they have the curved front glass front on the candy counter. My uncle ran that store. That was called Stevens Brothers General Store. And many a trip was there with Google eyes looking over the counter, wishfully thinking that you had a nickel or a penny even. Penny would, you could do business with a penny then. But my uncle, that particular uncle, had a gold tooth right in the front. And I remember his gold tooth better than I remember him. Next door to that was a small building. It was the post office. And the walls were filled with these little cubby holes with the iron front on them and your own combination to open it and get your mail. Well, I had an aunt that was a postmistress. She ran that. The next establishment on that side of the road was a probably one of the nicer homes in Portage. And my aunt was married to the man that lived there. And I don't know that I ever knew. He was quite distinguished. He was a little aloof and stood away from the riffraff, wore the bib overalls, And so we used to go to his house because we delivered the milk and everything to the town grocery store, both stores. And we'd take 2 extra quarts of milk or butter or whatever she wanted and take them in and put them in the refrigerator for them in the house. So we were in the house, but I never saw him in that house. He was always off on business somewhere. I don't know that they had a great deal of money, but it was interesting. The next house was owned by another uncle, Uncle Hubert, and he lived there for years, and he eventually sold the house to my Uncle Herbert.
Herb.
Yeah, Herb. And so we had gotten through the main street, and the entire right side of it was run by Stephen's family relations or Stephen's family. And as you got to Uncle Hugh's house, Hubert's, the Protestant church sat right on the corner opposite his house. And you had church service whenever an itinerant minister came down from Fort Kent, was traveling through the county, and you would go in there and he would announce that there were going to be services there, and the word would spread. Just beyond the church, on the west side of it, I had an uncle that owned that house. He was the church custodian. And I had a lot of cousins and various people in that house, and I can't remember what his name was. But he was it's hard to explain just what this was, but there was one in every town who worked for the railroad. And they were like timber cruisers that would go out and they would do certain things in the woods and mark trees. They took care of the rails. They saw to ordering paint and seeing that something was painted that needed it. They had a section of the railroad for which they were responsible. He did this.
There's a drink here if you want to.
Yeah.
It's that ginger ale we had for lunch.
So cool.
And when you're ready to take a break, let me know because we can shut it down and start again. So.
Just a minute more, I think. So it was interesting. Downtown, there wasn't a lot in downtown Portage. However, there used to be an ice house down there. And everybody took their sawdust down and piled it. And he would go out on the lake and he would cut blocks of ice, bring it in, pile it in the ice house, and pack it in the sawdust so that it would cut down on the melting through the summer. So that was kind of interesting. There was a sawmill down there. The logs would come into Portage Lake and they would go ahead and process some of it there.
Yeah.
Further down that road in front of the church is now that road is going to the west. And it's at the foot of this heavy, steep Hayward's Hill out on the main drag. And it went around, and this road was along the base of it. And part way around it, you had, that's where the Catholic Church was. And since most of the people in Portage were Canadian or Catholic, French people.
Sort of French, yeah.
It had the biggest congregation. But the least say, they weren't as influential in running the town as the people from the whatever the church was.
I'm sure it was whatever the minister was who came through town.
Yeah, whoever it was is what you were. And but Halbert, that was Uncle Hal that had the house next door and was the custodian of the church. And the word used to get to him that there would be church services coming, thus and such. So he would go over and he would cut the wood and he would get the fire, see that the fire was lit on Sunday morning, that the church was warm enough for everybody to get in. So things got done. And most of them weren't paid. They were things that needed to be done to have church, and they wanted church. But it was interesting. And his wife was the postmistress that I mentioned before. So their family really had two of them.
Yeah.
Key.
They were kind of the cogs that made the town turn, yeah.
Right. So that gets you around and going up the east side of Portage Lake now. And you had the ice house downtown, you had the mill, which supplied much of the sawdust for the ice house.
Right.
And you could drive along that until you went up the west side of the road. And all along the east and the west side, most people in town had a cottage built. They would have picked out a spot and built a cottage, and it was a family cottage. Anybody that got there had it for the day. Or you would join them and you became part of a party that was there for the day. Or if you wanted it for a week, you let everybody, Fred and his family are there for the week, and so everybody's there, you know. And so it was a very, very general thing. You never signed a piece of paper to say you're signing in. You didn't pay for it. Nobody paid for it. When it needed repairs, we'd get people that used it. Together, they would make the repairs, repair the little gravel road that went in the driveway, and things. But this is the way things get done. I told you about how Hayward's Hill got its name. Fred Hayward was at the base. On the other side of the road, there was a fellow that they called Uncle Sam. He had been there for years. And this is to tell you what people did for people. I was looking for my granddad one time and asked my grandmother where he was. And she said, Uncle Sam is under the weather down there. He can't take care of his cattle. Somebody's got to milk his cows. Somebody's got to see that they're fed. He's gone down to see that Uncle Sam is okay down there, check on him. And that's where he is. Well, I took it for granted somebody would go in and see that Uncle Sam, I don't know what his name was. He was Uncle Sam.
Yeah.
But it seems as though everybody had a cottage around the lake. And I assume that many of these cottages are still there. The couple of them that I was in were so old that they were falling down. And you live in it, and you know that all moldy where the bed was located. But that was the camp. You expected these things when you went to the camp. We used to go there and go swimming, even though there was a fair beach for the town further on. And but these things are my memories that I'm telling you about. They are things that impressed me. The way that people fit together to take care of each other, and what they enjoyed, and the fact that they did not look at the condition of some place where they were invited to a picnic on a Sunday afternoon if it wasn't first class accommodations or anything like this. No, if you had a canoe, you'd take a canoe. If you didn't, you went without. Or borrowed, or they were gracious about this. But as you go up Hayward Hill, you come to the top of it and it levels off. And that's just a general rundown of the town and impressions and things that I remember about the town. The first home or farm that you came to on top of the hill was Fred Stevens' farm. Well, that was my grandfather, Frederick Stevens. And he had 100-acre farm that was cut right back into the North Woods. Both sides were the same length, I think, and the back was determined the width, and it was the same on the right border of the road. And my Uncle Ralph, that was a big family they had there. And I didn't mention that there were a couple of aunts that lived downtown in the building. This fellow that I said was a little bit on the aloof side. His name was Will Ross. Will Ross. And my aunt was married to him. He was highly thought of, and just why it never affected me as a kid, since I wasn't impressed one way or the other. I was just there,
Right.
But you come up to the 100 acres that my granddad had, immediately adjoining to the north, and on the east side of the road we've been traveling on, was another 100-acre lot that was almost identical in shape, which belonged to my Uncle Ralph.
I'm just checking the time on the recording. You keep going. We're still going strong. Good.
And he had a house, a little house, unoccupied, on the farm there. And he used to stay with my grandmother and grandfather. My Uncle Ralph had a hunchback, and he walked stooped over a whole lot. I can remember him getting dressed on Sundays when there were church, and going up and walking down that long hill to the church and then walking back. But that was important to him. And but he did all of the odd jobs and things around on the farm, and he was my mentor. He went out and he pulled weeds in some of the properties. And this keeping him there on the farm where they could watch him and help him with what he needed help with was compensation for the use of his 100-acre farm up above. Each of the farms had a rather large orchard, and every apple tree was different. There was a multitude of kinds of apples, some of which you wouldn't want to touch to taste or anything else, because they were so far gone you couldn't even remember the names of the apples that were on them. But some of them were delicious too. They had yellow, transparent apples that you always waited to come out in the spring because they were soft and sweet. And Macintoshes, of course, they were everywhere there. I think we have come to the point where I would like to talk about my grandfather. And why he had such an influence on me. And take into consideration now that this is a man that probably never got beyond the 4th grade. He came from a big family, and he is the one that wound up with the farm and continued to farm. The rest of them, as you previously noted, scattered through the town and were influential in much of the operation of the town itself. But my grandfather was probably, I feel, one of the greatest influences in my life. And he had no education. he treated me like an equal human being, and I was still only 7, 8, 9 years old. It was pre-high school, because when I got into high school, I was tied up summers. So it would have been through junior high school years and prior to that I would go up and spend summers on the farm with him. And he was a quiet man. He didn't say an awful lot, but he was a handsome man too. And I realized that when I saw him around other women, that I suspect, surely to goodness, he had to be attracted to them as well as them to him. And the obvious thing to me was that they were attracted to him at that time. So wherever he went, he had an instant popularity because people liked him. Good personality, good-looking man. And he wasn't overbearing in any way. I remember one particular event that happened when I was with him. I was alone with him in the truck. And you remember my falling off the hay rake down onto the road, being dragged by the tines of the rake for a little ways. And we were going up that road to the way out in the back field. He was looking at whatever the crop was we were growing back there. And it had been a bad drought that summer. Everything was dried out. The crops weren't growing, and it looked like the complete year for potatoes and everything else could be wiped out. There was no way to get water to these things. And one day he took me in the truck with him, and we were driving down the slope, the initial slope, that road. And as we went down it, it began to rain. Not heavy, but it was raining. And I looked over at him, and the man, there were tears coming down his face. And he looked at me and he said, "Fred," he said, "that's one of God's greatest blessings. And you take them for granted. You should never take them for granted. The rain is coming, and if it continues to rain, it will save our crop. It may even save the farm." And I never forgot that time with him, because he was expressing some of his inner feelings to me, a kid, and sharing them with me. Well, I didn't forget it. I feel that had a lot to do with the building of whatever character I had. Okay. So we went down into the backfield and did whatever we had. Along the north side of that field, you were up against the woods. And you go through the woods. It was narrow through there, narrow woods. You go through it, and you were on Uncle Ralph's farm. And there was a road down there where you could go bumpy through the creek bottom to cross it and get into his property and come back, and the road went through the pasture and back to the house again. But many is a trip I used to take just for fun, all alone. I used to love to go down to this little copse of woods between the two farms and walk around in there. I wasn't afraid to be alone in the woods at that age. I would go in. I knew where I was. It was home to me. And some incidents occurred that I remember. And you might be interested in hearing about some of them, because they build my category or my repertoire of stories. One of them is that I remember going out into the field, and deer used to come on the back part, right up against the north woods of Maine, in the back of that field. And there used to be the remnants of oats and things that you've grown at the farm and that had blown up in there and everything. And then shoot, there was a herd of 14 deer up there. They'd come out of the woods. They felt safe because they were step right back into the woods, but they could find something to eat and crop along through there. And I was impressed to see all these deer together. My grandfather, at one time, spent time in the woods before he started farming. And he was the cook for a logging operation. And he worked in the marshalling yard. And one of the responsibilities of the cook was to provide all the meat that they ate in this logging camp, on all these loggers, and everybody would come in and sit down at their table, and he would have prepared meals for every one of them. But he said, I never left the marshalling yard where they would switch the logs and things in and process them and then haul them out of the woods. But he said, I provided it all, and I had to not only provide it, I had to go out and shoot it. And he said, I never had to leave that marshalling yard at all to shoot a deer.
That's how much game was there.
There was that much game available in the woods, and that's what people working in the woods out there, cutting trees and twitching them into the central camp where they were. I can vividly remember a picture. They had sawed a big tree that they cut, and they'd cut a slab out of it, not a board long, but just like cutting across the tree, cut the base off a Christmas tree, you know, and it stood it up on its side. And my granddad was 6 feet or over. And this thing was twice as high as he was tall.
Boy.
Because he was standing right in front of it, and picture taking, old tin type picture type.
Yep.
He had impressed with that too. I said, gee whiz, I've never seen anything quite that size.
Yeah.
I've seen much bigger trees since, but it's out in the northwest of this country. And boy, I'm amazed at the size of some of those trees they cut. But I also remember in the back of our back field out there where I'd seen all the deer, of going out there one day, and I'd been mystified by walking around in the woods back there and finding little bundles of grain. I don't know if you're familiar with the stooking and techniques, but you would put the reaper out there, drawn by a tractor generally, and it would go through the oats, and the scythe motion would cut it off at the base, and these things would be all stalks with the oats on the end of it still attached, would be go into the bed and scooped up and go down and automatically be tied into a bundle so that the bottom was all the stalks, and the top had the oats on all these stalks. And it would throw the bundles off the side or let the bundles just run off a conveyor. And you'd go through the field and you would have these little bundles all over the place. And a man coming along behind it, and he took these stooks and made a great big bundle so that you had 8 or 10 of these in the field. When you came to retrieve them, you only had to go these and load those on rather than go from every single little stoop that was occurred. And but I'd seen these with the strings around them and everything back in the woods, tucked under the roots of trees. And I I was kind of fascinated as to what are they doing back here in the woods? The wind has never blown hard enough to blow back in the woods like that. But I came upon a mother bear back in the back field back there. I didn't get too close, but I could see what they were doing. She had 2 cubs. And she was showing the cubs how to stand on their back feet, go over and pick these stalks of grain in their front arms, carry them back to the woods, and tuck those things down under the root. And I never forgot that. They were so cute. And I said, I'd learned from people that said, if you're trapped by a bear, and don't try to outrun it on level ground or uphill. Said, run downhill. He said, they've got to hold on the brakes. They weigh 200-300 pounds, and that's all that was on my mind when I'd see these bears. Stay away and just watch them, but they were so cute. Those little bears come out, and they'd get their bundle of oats and take it, and what they used to do is thrash the oats right out in the field. And they would take the thrasher, they would rent it, and it would come in. Well, the thrasher would go from farm to farm to farm and do everybody's. And I suspect they communally rented this rather. But they would come in and that thing would thrash, and they'd give the oats off, and it would fall and go into a container on the receptor, the machine. The stalks, they simply blew those into a pile, and shoot, what would be a pile that was almost as big as the barn out there come spring, and then it flattened right down to the ground, through the winter. This is another incident that I learned the hard way. But a friend of mine, he always was up around the farm, and a buddy of mine, I've forgotten just what I wanted to say.
You were talking about the stalks from the oats in the big pile.
Okay, they had flattened down in the spring, and he and I had were roaming around out there and saw this great big area covered with straw. We had previously, I think I may have mentioned the road that went in front of the main farmhouse. With elm trees all along it. People used to come along, tourists would come by, and they'd see these beautiful elm trees all along that stretch of road, and they would stop and get picnic baskets out and not come in and ask, but you weren't surprised to look out there and see somebody enjoying the trees. Somewhere along the line, somebody from the farm had put a rope swing up in the tree, so a swing back and forth. And they used to enjoy that, and once the swing was there, it was free territory. You'd come, and everybody used to come and stop there. And we used to enjoy sitting in our backyard, on our picnic area, ground there, and see these people enjoying the view and the countryside and the farm and everything from out there. Well, apparently when somebody was swinging in the swing, these wooden matches, sulfur matches, that he said, if it must have fallen out of somebody's pocket. And I found them, and I promptly put them in my pocket. And I happened to have these when we found that pile of straw. And it was way out in the middle of nowhere. There weren't any trees near it. There was no fields that were going to get hurt or anything. And we started little fires in this thing. And we'd get one little fire going, and then we'd put it out. Now, this was great fun. And then we kept build a little bit bigger fire this time. And all of a sudden, it got away from us. And when I saw we weren't going to be able to control that fire and put it out, I headed for the barn across 2 farms at that point. And went in and said, I've got a fire going down there in the old straw pile. And they never blinked an eye at all. They said, it's not going anywhere. Why worry about it? So it burned itself out. But it sure scared me. I thought I was going to burn Aroostook County down. And but it didn't. It stayed within the confines of it. But so much for the oaks.
Yeah.
But I remember we had to retrieve hay from some of these fields and go and haul it in, put it up in the barn. We had a hay wagon, and it was one of those that had a crib on the back. It was built as to haul hay in. And the farmers would haul this down along these stoops of hay that they had built in the field and throw them up on the load. And somebody would be on the load, generally one of us kids, and we would spread that hay and tromp it all down so that you could get the maximum amount for your efforts into the wagon. The wagon itself was interesting. It was all wood pole. It was made of it. It was open on the sides. Consequently, when you were in an area where farmers haul their hay in something like this on the roads, all the bushes on the side of the road would have hay or straw or something in it where the bush had dragged the side of the hay or the whatever you were hauling. But they used to haul that into the farm. My Uncle Ralph's farm was on a side hill. And we were hanging out there one day, and we're going along nicely. The wagon would be pulled by the horses, and people would throw the hay up, they would build the load. My granddad was driving the team, setting up in the wagon on driving, and went to make a turn, and on the side hill, he must have put one wheel in a rut or something, and and the whole wagon rolled. And of course, we pictured my grandfather as being an old man. Who knows? He might have been 50 years old, maybe, at that time. And, we were scared to death for fear that he was dead, because the wagon rolled right over with him. He was somewhere
in there, yeah.
They got him out, and we took him into the house. He came through that like a real trooper, but it really made an impression on me. I said, we almost lost my grandfather. And but the man survived through all that as much as it scared the rest of us.
Yeah.
And we didn't think he could survive a roll like that in a wooden wagon with horses attached to it, no less. And but he did. And nothing miraculous about it. It just happened. And it happened. And the events, the good comes from some of these things.
Yeah.
And it makes you realize that somebody else is kind of influencing your life as you go about your daily life. And the good Lord was there for him. And my granddad knew it. My granddad went to church every time that they had church. And but I remember that incident vividly, standing out as one of the things that scared me. It's like my starting a fire that I couldn't control. It scared me. And I learned something from that. I don't recall ever lighting anything out like that. Even. But
you used to enjoy the lighter fluid on the charcoal grill.
Yeah, I know. I should have known that one of my kids would take that burnt charcoal, throw it up in the air, come down, hit it right between the eyes. Poor old fellow, you couldn't see anything.
One more trip to the emergency room.
Yes, one more. My grandfather and that farm and Portage Lake itself influenced me and developed me to the next stage of my life. Well, the next stage isn't over. I'm still living it, and I'm affected by things that I absorbed when I was on the farm and things that my grandfather taught me. Now, this was in the absence of my father. Some of the time was spent while he was in Europe. He wasn't available to spend time with me. Sue and I were married. She had this 4-door Oldsmobile that she had. And I had a Buick. And we couldn't afford to pay the rent on both of them. So we had her Oldsmobile up on blocks behind the first apartment that we lived in Thomaston. And it sat there. We didn't do anything with it. We didn't think of selling it. It was Sue's car, you know. And unless she had said to me, look, why don't we sell that? Well, maybe we'll use it. And but one day, my Uncle Herbert, this is the one from the farm, and I think my granddad was there, and my father and mother came down to visit us in the apartment in Thomas. This was right across the road from Main Street, from the house that we bought years ago, afterward. And so they came and they went upstairs to the room with no windows in it and everything else. And it was what we had. But he was looking for an automobile. And I said, well, we've got 2, and we don't use one of them. I said, why don't you consider taking one of these? Our intent was give it to him. And he said, no. He said, I've got some money. Well, I know he didn't have a heck of a lot of money. But I said, well, why don't you give us $25 and you can have this car? And he said, let's go see if we can start it up. And sure enough, he drove off in it when I went back. And for years, he had this car as his transportation in Portage. And it was had a nice looking car, really. It was impressive. It was a big, long Oldsmobile with fins and all this garbage. The American pickers would have loved it because it was parked out behind somebody's house on blocks. At some point in time, when he got to be older, he just could not run the farm. And my Uncle Herbert, who really was the strength and the broad shoulders, doing the heavy work, he got married and was raising a family of his own. And didn't live on the farm any longer. They did for a while. They lived in that, come in the front door out of the shed and go up the outdoor stairway, and they lived in the apartment up there. But they eventually got a place of their own, a house, and they enjoyed it a great deal. At some point, he got to the age where he knew he couldn't operate the farm himself. And the rest of his family had gone on. My Uncle Ralph died, and he had to be taken to a hospital in Fort Kent, way north of Portage, but that's where the hospital was. And he got up there, had a hernia operation, and got hiccups, and they couldn't stop the hiccups. And that's what he died of, was hiccups. Yeah. I'm sure there's a name for it.
Right.
Hiccups is what they described to me as what was happening to him when he passed on. All right, so he needed a place to live. Well, there was no question. We took him into the house down in Holt. So he became a sitting man, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And it was so nice to see him around the house, sitting in an easy chair or out in the backyard, giving advice on where I ought to plant this and plant that in the garden. And that happened to be the garden patch where Grampie looked out one morning, and there were 2 elephants in the middle of her garden. And I take it you don't have elephants in your garden out there. No. But we lived right, our backyard abutted the old racetrack and everything. They used to train sulky racers with their wagons and horses, train the horses and moored the horses through the winter there. And they were going to have a fair. And that's where the elephants came from, was from the fair. But one night they got out and come wandering around our side of the fence. And
just needed some turnips.
They wanted turnips or something around, who knows what. I didn't get close enough. Well, I didn't see them. And I know my mother didn't go too close to a couple of elephants. But he used to sit out there in his wooden chair and just enjoy life, smoking his pipe. It was the first time I ever saw that man when he wasn't working, doing something. I don't know if I told the story yesterday of picking him up in my arms. He couldn't manipulate himself to go to the hospital. And I took him, and I literally had to pick that man up in my arms and carried him over to the hospital and took him in. I forgot what I was going to say story to this. But he had been in and had problems with this and that, as any old person has. He said, the doctor, I can remember hearing him say it. He said, Fred has lived a tough life, all his life. He says, I can't operate inside on his stomach because he has been operated on so many times, there's no place to hook anything. He said he has worn out every organ he's got. He said they're just worn out. He said you can't tie them together. You can cut off parts and throw them away, but he said there's a limit to how much you can do and how much the man is going to have for joy of life after you have done all this to him. He's had enough done to him already in his life. He's lived through it, and he's still the most gracious man in the world. But that was the end of him. I never forget picking him up and carrying him in. The hospital was called the Madigan Memorial Hospital. It was an old Madigan, was the name of the family that gave it to the town, really. Mm-hmm. And probably the taxes and upkeep got to the point where they couldn't keep it, so they gave it to the town. But at any rate, it turned into a facility, and it was a nursing home and everything else. And Grampie actually was in part of this facility when she was up there in assisted living. Mm-hmm. Well, because they built a couple more buildings to go with it. Yeah. But I sort of floated away from what I was talking to.
That's about. Okay. Yeah. I just kind of wanted us to have that story of you taking your grandfather to the hospital.
Yeah.
It's kind of what you could give back.
Yeah. It was something, the only thing that I could do for my grandfather.
Yeah.
And yet it wasn't anything. But I'm pleased it was me that did it.
Yeah.
had done so much for me. And there was pleasure in holding that man. As weak as he wasn't even the same man that I knew. But he was. And I truly think he knew it. And he appreciated me carrying him into the hospital.
Right.
Yeah, life is odd. It's funny.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good and it's kind to all people. Your blessings, as he said, don't ignore your blessings. See them when they come. God is there. He's looking after you. There's a purpose and he'll lead you to it. He expects you to do it, but he'll get you there. Head you down the right path. No, but that is much the story of my time.